What happens when the path to God leads not to light, but into darkness, when every certainty dissolves, and the soul feels abandoned, stripped of its familiar supports? In the 16th century, the Spanish mystic and poet St. John of the Cross explored this profound transformation in his masterpiece, The Dark Night of the Soul. For him, the dark night is not punishment but a spiritual passage, a process where the ego, attachments, and false identities dissolve, clearing the way for direct union with the divine. In this video, we'll dive into St. John's vision of the dark night, exploring why it feels like emptiness, how it dismantles the illusion of separation, and why, for him, this descent into unknowing is the gateway to spiritual liberation and pure awareness. St. John of the Cross was born in 1542 in Fontiveros, Spain, during a period of deep religious reform. A Carmelite friar, poet, and theologian, he became one of the most influential figures in Christian mysticism. Alongside Saint Teresa of Avila, he sought to renew the Carmelite order, emphasizing contemplation, simplicity, and inner transformation. His mystical writings, particularly The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night of the Soul, explore the stages of the soul's journey toward God. But John was not an abstract philosopher. His teachings arose from lived experience. Imprisoned by his fellow friars for his reforms, he endured months of solitude and suffering, during which he composed some of his most luminous poetry. Through his writings, he offers a map for the soul's transformation, showing that the apparent loss of light is not the end of faith, but its deepest beginning. For St. John, the dark night of the soul begins when familiar sources of meaning, the comforts of faith, emotional devotion, intellectual certainty, no longer sustain us. It feels like abandonment, yet he describes it as an act of divine love. God darkens the faculties of the mind and senses, so the soul can detach from its reliance on lower forms of perception and ego-driven desires. In this stage, prayer feels empty, beliefs seem fragile, and the self's old patterns begin to dissolve. But St. John insists that this is not spiritual failure, it is purification. The dark night strips away illusions, forcing the soul to confront its deepest attachments, not only to worldly things but even to its own ideas about God. It is the dying of the false self, the unraveling of all the ways we try to control the divine mystery. As the dark night deepens, the ego, the part of us that clings to identity, security, and control, begins to dissolve. St. John describes this as entering a luminous emptiness, where the self gradually surrenders its need to know, define, and possess God. Without these structures, the mind enters a state of radical openness, allowing pure awareness to emerge, awareness unburdened by the filters of desire and fear. In this silence, the soul realizes that its deepest longing has never been for external objects but for union with the infinite source of being itself. Paradoxically, by losing its sense of self, the soul discovers its truest essence, not as an isolated individual, but as a participant in the divine life, inseparable from the presence it once sought outside itself. Although the dark night feels like loss, St. John teaches that within the apparent absence lies a greater presence. The darkness is not the withdrawal of God, but the blinding intensity of divine light, which the human faculties are not yet able to perceive. Just as eyes unaccustomed to brilliance must adjust before seeing clearly, the soul must pass through unknowing before it can bear direct union. St. John calls this stage divine darkness, echoing earlier mystical traditions like those of Dionysius the Areopagite. It is a place where concepts fail, prayer falls silent, and the heart learns to rest in a reality beyond comprehension. In this mystery, faith deepens, not as belief in doctrines, but as surrender to the immediacy of divine presence. What emerges from the dark night is not simply hope, but transformation, a new way of being that no longer seeks God outside, but awakens to God within. For St. John, the journey culminates in union with the divine, where the boundaries between self and God dissolve into pure awareness and love. This union is not an escape from life, but a transformation of perception. The soul comes to see the entire cosmos as suffused with divine presence. Freed from the compulsions of the ego, one lives from a deeper place of stillness, compassion, and openness, St. John describes this state as the fulfillment of the soul's longing, the moment when the hidden spark of divinity within us fully merges with its source. The dark night was necessary because it stripped away every false attachment, leaving only what is eternal. What began as emptiness ends in fullness, and what felt like loss reveals itself as liberation. St. John reminds us that the deepest awakening often arrives not when we find answers, but when we surrender to the mystery itself.